She has no idea we recorded everything." That was the last thing I heard before my son's voice cut off completely. For a moment I thought the call had dropped. Then I realized he hadn't hung up. I had. My thumb had found the red button on instinct, before my brain had even processed what my ears had just delivered to it. My name is Gerald Whitmore. I am 68 years old. I spent 31 years as a structural engineer for the city of Edmonton. I raised 2 children with my wife, Patricia, in a house on the south side of the River Valley. I have a daughter named Claire who lives in Vancouver. I have a son named Marcus who lives in Calgary, and I have, for the past 14 months, been a widower. I sat in my truck in the parking lot of a Canadian Tire on a Tuesday afternoon in late November, a bag of weather stripping on the passenger seat, the sky the color of old concrete, and a silence around me that only comes after something irreversible. I want to tell you what I did next, but first, I need to tell you who I was before that phone call, and who the people around me had quietly become while I wasn't paying attention. Before I continue, if this story speaks to you, take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely connect with it. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now let me take you back to the beginning. To Patricia, to the house on Canyon Road, to the kind of man I thought I had raised. Patricia passed away 14 months before that afternoon in the parking lot. Pancreatic cancer. From diagnosis to the end was 7 weeks. Long enough to say the important things, not long enough to say them all the way through. She was 64 years old. She had a laugh that started silent, just her shoulders shaking, before the sound caught up. She made lists, on paper, on the fridge, on the counter, on the back of envelopes she saved for no other reason. We had a list on the refrigerator that said, Alaska Highway, RV rental, June or July, before it gets too cold. It was still there. I hadn't taken it down. We met in 1979 at a company picnic for an engineering firm where I had just started and where she worked in project administration. She told me later that she'd noticed me before I noticed her, which she said was typical. She was probably right. I was not a man who led with observation. I was a man who led with structure. Patricia was the one who noticed the texture of things, the quality of a silence, the shift in someone's posture, the meaning behind a word chosen carefully. She was better at people than I was. She always had been. We married in 1981. We bought the house on Canyon Road in 1987. We raised Marcus and Claire in it. Claire is 4 years older than Marcus, 43 now, and lives in Vancouver with her partner, a quiet man named David who restores furniture for a living. She called every other week after Patricia passed. Not every week, but every other week, reliably, which I respected more than the calls that started strong and tapered. Marcus called every Sunday without fail, from the day after Patricia's funeral to the day I sat in that parking lot. It was his idea. He said he didn't want me sitting alone in the house without anyone checking in. I told him I wasn't the type to fall apart. He said he knew that, but that he wanted to call anyway. I let him. I understood that the calls were as much for him as for me. Marcus was 39. He lived in Calgary with his wife Renata and their 8-year-old daughter Sophie. He was a project manager at a construction firm. He was good at his job, the kind of confident that comes from never having had to start over, which I do not say as a criticism. It was simply true. He'd had advantages I hadn't had at his age. University paid for. First car purchased new. A wedding we contributed to substantially, though the number is not one I will name here. I was proud of him for what he'd built. I told Patricia that. I told her regularly, even after she couldn't hear me say it anymore. Renata I had known for 11 years. She was organized, precise, always the one driving the schedule when they visited. Patricia had said once, not unkindly, she calculates things. I told her that wasn't a flaw. Patricia said she knew, but that it was worth noting. I remembered that conversation after the parking lot. I wished I had held it a little closer when she'd first said it. Sophie was different, 8 years old and entirely her own person. All warmth, no calculation. A child who still ran across the driveway to hug me when they arrived. who asked me to tell her about bridges because she knew I'd designed them, who sat beside me at dinner and talked with her whole face. She was the reason I looked forward to their visits the way I did. I told Patricia that too in the kitchen, 3 days before she went into the hospital for the last time. Patricia said, "Sophie is the best of all of us." She meant it as a compliment to all of us. I think now she may have meant it as a warning about the rest. That November, I had been thinking about my estate, not morbidly, practically, the same way I'd thought practically my whole career. Patricia and I had a financial advisor, a man named Clive Ostrander, who worked out of an office on White Avenue and who had helped us build a portfolio over 30 years that I was quietly proud of. After Patricia died, the portfolio became mine alone. The house on Canyon Road I owned outright, bought and paid for in 2009. The combined value of what I had built was not a secret, but the specific numbers were mine. I had always believed that telling your children exactly what they stood to inherit was a fast way to make them start seeing you as a problem to be managed. My own father said that to me once. I had never forgotten it. I had a will. It named Marcus as executor and primary beneficiary. It set aside a portion for Sophie in a trust she could access at 25. It included a bequest to Patricia's sister, Eleanor, a modest but meaningful sum that Patricia had specifically requested. The will was clean and straightforward, the kind of document that shouldn't require much work when the time came. Marcus knew about it in general terms. He did not know the specific figures. That had always seemed right to me. I see now that I had made one assumption I should not have made, that he had accepted not knowing. In October, 6 weeks before the parking lot, Marcus began nudging me about coming to Calgary for a visit. He framed it differently each time, fresh eyes on the portfolio, getting things sorted, useful to have family close by. He mentioned that Ranata had a friend who worked in estate planning, a woman named Dr. Sylvia Crane, who had, Marcus said, helped several families streamline things. He used that word, streamline. He used it the way people use a word when they mean something adjacent to it. I told him I'd think about it. He said that was all he was asking. 3 weeks he nudged, and then, on a Tuesday in November, he called midweek, not on a Sunday, to ask whether I'd looked at a financial planning seminar in Calgary he'd sent me information about. I said I hadn't gotten to it. He said that was fine. We talked for 10 minutes about Sophie's hockey and a problem he was having with a subcontractor. He said he had to go. I said goodbye. The line didn't disconnect. There was a shift in the audio, the ambient sound of his kitchen, a chair scraping, and then Renata's voice, close to the phone, the way a voice sounds when someone doesn't realize the call is still live. She has no idea we recorded everything. Marcus's response was lower. I caught fragments. Something about the accounts, something about before he talks to Clive again. Then the call dropped for real. I sat with the weather stripping in my lap. The word recorded was the one that caught in my chest. Recorded what? I hadn't said anything on that call that I wouldn't say in public. I was careful with money conversations, always had been. So what had they recorded, and why did Renata think I had no idea? I drove home. I made tea. I sat at the kitchen table where Patricia and I had eaten breakfast for 26 years, and I turned those 2 words over in my mind. We recorded everything. She, not he, not Dad. She. There were 2 women in the relevant picture. One was Patricia, who was dead. The other was Patricia's sister Eleanor, who was 71, who lived in a small house in Spruce Grove, and who was named as a secondary beneficiary in my will. Eleanor was sharp-tongued and funny, and had once told Marcus when he was being difficult at a family dinner that charm without substance was just weather. He had not forgotten it. I doubted very much that he had forgiven it. I didn't sleep well that night, but I didn't panic. Panic was never my operating mode. I sat with what I knew and began the work of understanding it. I called Eleanor the next morning. She answered on the second ring. We talked for a few minutes about nothing in particular before I asked her, as carefully as I could, whether Marcus or Renata had been in touch with her recently. There was a pause. Marcus called me about 2 weeks ago, she said. He asked me some questions about your financial situation. I told him I didn't know your financial situation. What kind of questions? He wanted to know if you'd updated your will after Patricia, whether you'd mentioned making any changes, whether I'd noticed anything. She paused, choosing the word deliberately. Unusual. About your judgment lately. That last part landed like cold water against the back of my neck. He asked about my judgment? He framed it as concern, Eleanor said. He said he'd noticed you were more forgetful than usual, that he was worried. He mentioned the word capacity in passing. He said it like he was just thinking out loud. I thanked Eleanor. I told her not to say anything to Marcus about our conversation. She said she wouldn't. And then she said, in the voice she used when she wasn't going to say something twice, Gerald, be careful. I was already being careful. I just hadn't known yet what I was being careful about. That evening, I called Clive Ostrander. He picked up from home, which he always did for long-standing clients, and I asked him whether anyone had contacted his office recently regarding my accounts. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, yes, a woman had called 3 days earlier. She had identified herself as a licensed estate planner acting on behalf of my family. She had asked about the process for updating beneficiary designations and whether my accounts were structured in a way that would require probate. She had not given her full name. She had given a firm name that Clive had not recognized and had not been able to verify when he looked it up afterward. He had told her he could not discuss my accounts with a third party and that if I wanted to make changes, I would need to initiate that process directly. He had meant to call me, he said. He was sorry he hadn't yet. Don't make any changes to anything, I said, regardless of who calls, regardless of how they frame the request. And if anyone contacts you again, I want to know immediately, and I want you to keep a written record of it. He said he understood. His voice had a quality that told me he understood more than I'd said. I did not sleep that night, not from panic, but from work. 31 years of structural engineering had taught me that before you can fix a load-bearing problem, you need to understand exactly where the force is being applied and where the failure point is. I spent those hours mapping what I knew, what I suspected, and what I needed to confirm. By 5 a.m., I had a list. The next morning, I drove to a shop on Jasper Avenue and bought a small digital recorder, the kind that fits in a shirt pocket. 40 hours of recording on a single charge. I had used one in the field years ago for site notes. I knew how to use it. That same afternoon, I called my lawyer. Janet Cook had handled Patricia's estate. She was thorough, methodical, and direct in the way that good lawyers are. She told you what she found, not what you wanted to hear. I told her I wanted to review my estate documents and make some adjustments. I did not tell her everything on the phone. I told her enough. She had an opening the following week. The Sunday after the parking lot, I called Marcus as usual. I told him I'd been thinking about his suggestion, that I was open to coming to Calgary, that he was right. It made sense to get things organized. I used the word streamline back at him. I listened to the shift in his voice when I did, something that might have been relief or satisfaction or both. He said he was glad. He said Renata would be happy to hear it. He said Dr. Crane had an opening on the second Saturday of December. That works perfectly, I said. I meant it. Before I flew down, I sent Janet Cook a detailed email. I described the overheard phone call, the conversation with Eleanor, the call to Clive, the sequence of questions Marcus had asked about my capacity. I attached nothing yet. There was nothing to attach, but I outlined the shape of what I believed was happening. Janet called me back within an hour of receiving it. Her questions were sharp. She asked me to keep records of everything. She told me to contact her immediately after the Saturday meeting. And she said something I wrote down on a notepad and kept beside the recorder. What you're describing, Gerald, if accurate, has a name under Alberta law. Several names, in fact. I underlined that. I did not need to be told what those names were. I was beginning to understand them on my own. I arrived in Calgary on a Friday evening, 3 weeks after the parking lot. Marcus picked me up from the airport. Attentive, carrying my bag, buying dinner at a steakhouse near his house. He was the version of himself he showed to people he was trying to reassure. I knew that version. I had watched him deploy it his entire adult life. at job interviews, at family gatherings where things were tense, at the hospital, the one time he'd come, in the final week of Patricia's life. Ranata was warm at dinner, warmer than usual, the kind of warm that requires effort. Sophie sat beside me and told me about a project she was building at school, a model of a suspension bridge. She said it was because of me. I helped her think through the cable angles after dinner, while Marcus and Renata cleaned up and spoke quietly to each other in the kitchen. I couldn't hear words. I didn't need to. That night, lying in their guest room, I could hear the murmur of their voices through the wall. The recorder was on the nightstand. Everything I had documented so far was already in Janet Cook's hands. I thought about Patricia, about the Alaska Highway list on the fridge, about her saying she calculates things, worth noting. She had seen it before I did. She had been trying to tell me for 11 years. Saturday morning. Marcus drove me to an office building in the northwest part of the city. It was a nice building, not ostentatious, but the kind of address that was meant to signal stability. The office inside was similarly calibrated. Solid furniture, framed certificates on the wall, a reception desk staffed by a young woman who offered us water and said Dr. Crane would be right with us. The recorder was in my breast pocket. I had tested it twice before leaving the house. Dr. Sylvia Crane was approximately 50, well-dressed. She had the kind of practiced calm that either means deep competence or deep performance. She shook my hand and said she'd heard a great deal about me from Marcus. That was the first useful thing she said. It told me this was not an introductory meeting. Marcus had been talking to her well before today. "I want you to know," she said, settling into her chair, "that everything we discuss here is confidential and handled with complete discretion." I nodded slowly. I let my face arrange itself into the expression of a slightly overwhelmed widower. This was not difficult. The grief was real. I just directed it where I needed it to go. She walked me through what she called an estate optimization review, a process, she said, that many families find useful at transitional stages of life. She used that phrase twice. She had a document on the desk in front of her, already partially filled out. It was a preliminary overview of what a restructured plan might look like for someone in my situation. She knew the approximate value of my house. She knew I had investment accounts. The specific figures she did not have. Clive had given her nothing, but her estimates were close enough to tell me she had been gathering information from somewhere. Marcus, I assumed. Probably from the Sunday calls. I let her talk. I asked questions that sounded like the questions of a man who was carefully following along and feeling slightly out of his depth. I mentioned Patricia twice. Let my voice go quiet in a way that was both true and deliberate. She leaned forward slightly each time. She was reading me. She thought she was getting a clear signal. The recorder ran quietly in my pocket throughout. When she placed the first document in front of me, I read it fully. She waited with the patience of someone who has learned not to rush this moment. It was a power of attorney, not a limited financial power of attorney restricted to specific assets. A broad general power of attorney that would give Marcus authority over substantially all of my financial decisions. The document described this as a coordinated family estate management instrument, language I had never seen in any legitimate legal document in 30 years of working with contracts. I looked up at her. "I'd like to take this home and have my lawyer review it before I sign anything," I said. Something moved across her face. It was fast. She covered it smoothly, but I had spent 3 decades reading the faces of people in meetings when they received information they hadn't planned for. "Of course," she said, "that's completely reasonable. We can schedule a follow-up." Marcus had gone quiet beside me, a different kind of quiet from his usual. I folded the document, put it in my jacket pocket, said I thought that was probably enough for one day. In the car, driving back, Marcus was careful and pleasant and said almost nothing of substance. I matched him. We stopped for coffee. He paid. I thanked him. We talked about Sophie's hockey tournament, the traffic on Crowchild Trail, the weather coming in from the west. Neither of us mentioned the document in my pocket. That evening, while he and Renata were putting Sophie to bed, I sat in the guest room and called Janet. She listened. I read back the relevant portions of what the recorder had captured. The language of the power of attorney, Sylvia Crane's phrasing, the moment when I said I wanted my lawyer to review it, and the expression that crossed the doctor's face. Janet told me to bring the document home. Then she told me what she'd found. Sylvia Crane was not a licensed estate planner in Alberta. She held a certificate in financial counseling from an institution in British Columbia that Janet described with careful precision as not a recognized accrediting body. There were 2 complaints on file with the Alberta Securities Commission involving her name and a firm that had since dissolved. She was not, as far as Janet could determine, a doctor of anything. I sat in the guest room for a long time after that call. I could hear Sophie through the wall, asking Marcus to read to her. I heard him say yes. I heard his voice take on the gentler register he used with her. The voice I remembered from when he was young and not yet whatever he had become. I did not feel angry. I felt clear. The kind of clear that comes not from resolution, but from finally understanding the exact nature of the problem. The load had been identified. The failure point was visible. What remained was engineering. I know this is a lot to sit with. If this story is landing somewhere close to home, you're not alone. Thousands of people have found themselves in rooms exactly like that, a smiling face across the desk and documents that weren't what they appeared. Hit subscribe so you don't miss how this ends. And tell me in the comments, what would you have done in that guest room that night? I flew home on Sunday morning. Marcus hugged me at the airport, told me he was glad I'd come. I told him I was glad too. Sophie ran back to hug me a second time before I went through security. She whispered that she had fixed the cable angles on her bridge model and that it was much better now. I told her I'd known she would figure it out. I meant that. Whatever else was true, I meant that. The following week, I met with Janet Cook in her office on 104th Street. I laid the document on her desk. She read it in full. She asked 3 precise questions. Then she set it down and said, "Gerald, this is an attempt to strip you of financial autonomy. If you'd signed this and Marcus had chosen to act on it, your ability to manage your own affairs would have been effectively transferred to him without legal safeguard or independent oversight." I already knew this. Hearing it said plainly by someone else made something settle in my chest. "What do you want to do?" she asked. I told her. Over the following 2 weeks, Janet and I restructured my affairs with the deliberate care of people who are building something meant to last. I updated my will. The update was specific and thorough and was witnessed by 2 people who were not my son. I restructured 2 of my investment accounts so that any change to beneficiary designations required written notice to both Clive and Janet before taking effect. I added Eleanor as co-executor because she was steady and because she had told me to be careful before anyone else had. I provided Janet with a certified copy of the audio recording from the Saturday meeting, along with my notes from the conversation with Eleanor and the documented contact attempt to Clive's office. Janet filed a complaint with the Alberta Securities Commission regarding Sylvia Crane. She contacted the Law Society regarding a notary whose name appeared on Crane's documents. She documented everything. I did not call Marcus. I did not confront him. That was Janet's advice, and it was also my own instinct. The most important structural reinforcements are the ones in place before the load is applied. The confrontation, such as it was, came in February. Marcus called on a Sunday, as usual. We talked for a few minutes about nothing specific. Then he said, carefully, that Dr. Crane had apparently had some professional difficulties, that the follow-up meeting he'd been hoping to arrange might not be possible. He framed it as an unfortunate inconvenience. He asked, with studied casualness, whether I wanted him to look for someone else. I let a moment pass. "I've already taken care of things on my end," I said. "I'm happy with where everything stands." Silence. 4 seconds. 5. "Oh," he said. "Good." That was it. That single syllable. I heard in it everything he was not saying, the recalculation, the recognition that something had shifted, the understanding that the thing he had been carefully building toward had been dismantled before he'd reached it. I did not give him more than that. "How's Sophie?" I asked. He said she was good. She wanted to tell me about her bridge. He put her on. She talked for 20 minutes about load distribution and anchor points and a type of cable she'd read about called a suspension bundle. I sat in the kitchen on Canyon Road and listened to every word. But let me tell you what I also did in those weeks. What happened that I have not yet told you, because it belongs here, in the part of the story where the full picture comes into view. I know some of you are angry on my behalf right now, maybe furious. If this is hitting close to home, if you've ever sat across from someone performing warmth while calculating cost, tap that like button. The full picture is almost here. In the weeks between my return from Calgary and the Sunday call in February, 2 other things happened that I want to account for clearly. The first was a call I received from Eleanor. She had been contacted again, this time not by Marcus, but by a woman who identified herself as a representative of an estate planning firm and who wanted to ask Eleanor some follow-up questions about my general well-being. Eleanor had said, "I'm sorry, I think you have the wrong number." And then she had called me. I passed this information to Janet. She added it to the file. The second thing was a conversation I had with Claire. I had not told her what was happening. I hadn't known how to begin, and I hadn't wanted to fracture something before I understood the shape of it, but she called in early January, which was not her usual week, and she said simply that she'd heard from Marcus, and that he'd made some comments about my memory that she wanted to follow up on directly. "Your memory seems fine to me," she said. "It is fine," I said. "I know," she said. "That's why I called." We talked for 90 minutes. She knew some of what I told her, not all of it. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. "What do you need from me?" she asked. "Nothing yet," I said. "But I wanted you to know." She said she understood. She said she'd be on the next flight if I asked. I thanked her. I told her to stay put. And I thought about the way Marcus had spoken to her, using concern as a tool, using my memory as a weapon, trying to plant a seed that he could later cultivate. And I felt, for the first time since the parking lot, something close to anger. Not the hot kind, the cold, architectural kind, the kind that becomes productive when you know where to put it. I put it to work. March came. The Alberta Securities Commission formally concluded its investigation. Sylvia Crane was prohibited from offering financial services in the province. 2 other families she had worked with came forward during the process. The notary whose name appeared on her documents received a reprimand and a period of supervised practice. These were public outcomes, matter of record. Marcus was not charged with anything. What he had done, the questions to Eleanor, the call to Clive, the arrangement of the Saturday meeting, existed in a legal space that was difficult to prosecute absent a completed transaction. Janet told me this plainly. I told her I understood. What I had was something more durable than a legal outcome. I had clarity, and I had a structure that could not be quietly dismantled. Spring came to Edmonton with its usual deliberate patience. The snow on the river valley retreated in stages. The house on Canyon Road, which had been cold and too quiet all winter, admitted light again through the south-facing windows, the way Patricia had always said it would if you waited. I kept the Alaska Highway list on the fridge. I am not sure what that means. It means something. I haven't taken it down. In the weeks after February, the calls with Marcus continued. Weekly, predictable. The topics: Sophie's school, a project he was managing, the weather. He did not raise estate planning again. He did not raise Dr. Crane. He did not ask about my accounts or my will or my capacity. He asked whether I was eating well and whether I'd thought about getting a dog and whether the weather stripping I'd bought at Canadian Tire had solved the draft problem by the back door. I told him it had. Eleanor called more often. We had never been close in the way that proximity creates closeness, but we had always been 2 people who respected each other's straight talk. After Patricia died, and more so after everything I have told you, we developed the kind of friendship that late life sometimes makes available, unguarded and specific, and not interested in pretending. She came to Edmonton in March. We had dinner at a restaurant on White Avenue around the corner from Clive's office. She ordered the lamb. She said, "You know what the strange part is?" I said I didn't. She said, "I think he actually convinced himself he was helping." I thought about that for a long time afterward. I am still not sure whether it makes it better or worse. Claire came in April. She stayed for 5 days. She slept in the room that had been hers as a child, now used for storage, and she helped me sort through boxes in the basement that I had been avoiding since Patricia. One of them had Patricia's field notebooks from when she'd done administrative work on highway projects in the 80s, pages of neat handwriting and grid calculations that I hadn't seen in 30 years. We sat on the floor and read through them, and Claire said, "I didn't know Mom worked on those." I said she'd done a lot of things people didn't know about. Claire said, "That tracks." We both laughed at that. It was the first time I had laughed in a basement since Patricia died. I had my will formally reviewed and confirmed by a second independent lawyer in May. Janet thought it was unnecessary redundancy. I told her redundancy was how engineers slept at night. She conceded the point. Clive restructured the accounts as we'd discussed. Every change to beneficiary designations now requires written notice to both him and Janet, a 5-business-day waiting period, and a verification call to me at a number held only by Clive's office. It is, by some standards, cumbersome. By my standards, it is the minimum sensible tolerance for a load-bearing element. In June, I drove to Spruce Grove to have dinner with Eleanor. On the way back, I took a longer route along the river, the way Patricia and I used to on summer evenings. No destination, just the light on the water and the skyline in the east. I thought about what I had built and what had nearly been taken and what remained. The house, the accounts, the will, the records in Janet's files, the recording from a shirt pocket in a Northwest Calgary office building, and Sophie, who that week had won a regional science competition with her suspension bridge model. Marcus had sent me a photograph. She was holding a ribbon and grinning the way 8-year-olds grin, with their whole faces, with no reservation at all. I printed it and put it on the fridge beside the Alaska Highway list. I am Gerald Whitmore. I am 68 years old. I am a widower and a structural engineer, retired, living alone in a house on the south side of the River Valley in Edmonton, Alberta. I have a daughter I trust completely and a son I love and watch carefully. I have a granddaughter who wants to be an engineer and who I fully believe will be. And I have, as of the last 14 months, a set of documents, accounts, and legal arrangements that could withstand far more pressure than the kind that was applied to them. That is where the story stands. I want to say a few things before I finish. Things I have thought about since the parking lot and that I think are worth saying plainly. The first is this. What happened to me was not unusual. I want you to understand that. Older adults with assets are regularly, quietly, systematically assessed by the people around them for the ease with which control can be assumed. Sometimes this happens because families are genuinely struggling and making poor decisions under financial stress. Sometimes it happens because someone has decided that an inheritance deferred is an inheritance at risk. And sometimes, I believe this was closer to my situation, it happens because a person has been convinced by a plausible narrative that what they're doing is practical, even kind, and that the person they're targeting is simply too sentimental or too proud to do what needs to be done. I do not know entirely what Marcus believed. I know what he did. I know he asked Eleanor about my capacity. I know he arranged a meeting with a woman who was not who she claimed to be. I know a phone call was not properly ended, and that the first thing I heard in the silence was his wife's voice saying something she didn't expect me to hear. I carry those facts the way you carry any load-bearing truth, with full awareness of what it means for everything built around it. The second thing I want to say is about Patricia. She would have caught it sooner than I did. She was better at people. She had been trying to tell me for 11 years. In the gentle, steady way she said everything important, not as criticism, not as alarm, but as information worth noting. She calculates things. She had planted that word where I could find it when I needed it. I found it. That is what matters. The third thing I want to say is for the people watching this who recognize something in it. If you are older and you have assets that matter and people around you who know it, please do these things. Have a lawyer you trust, not a lawyer your family recommended. Your own lawyer, chosen by you, who reports to you. Have your accounts structured so that changes require more than one signature, more than one notification, more than one step. Know who has copies of your documents, and make sure at least one of those people has no stake in your estate. If someone around you begins raising questions about your capacity, your memory, your judgment, document it. Write it down with a time and date. These questions are sometimes raised out of genuine concern. They are sometimes raised for other reasons. You deserve to know which, and if someone uses the word streamline in a conversation about your finances, put your pen down and call your lawyer before you pick it up again. These are not cynical precautions. They are the same precautions you would take with any structure you expected to last. The same principles apply. Understand where the load is being applied. Identify the failure points. Reinforce before the force arrives. Sophie told me, the last time we spoke, that she had decided to specialize in bridge design. She wants to study the relationship between tension and stability, how structures remain standing under forces that would seem, to the untrained eye, to be more than they can bear. I told her that was one of the most important things an engineer can study. She asked me how bridges know when they're strong enough. I told her they don't know. That's why you build them stronger than you think you need to. She said she would remember that. I believe her. If this story reached you, if any part of it felt like something you've lived or feared or watched happen to someone you love, please leave a comment. Tell me, what would you have done differently in that parking lot? What would you have done the same? And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the moment. There are more stories to tell. Take care of yourselves. Really, I mean it.